There is something you have believed your entire life about your memory, something so automatic, so woven into how you experience every single day, that questioning it has probably never once occurred to you. You trust it completely. You rely on it constantly. You have built your understanding of who you are, your past, your relationships, your sense of continuity as a person, almost entirely on top of it. And yet, if you followed the science honestly, if you traced what neuroscience and cognitive psychology have actually discovered over the last several decades, and refused to look away from where that evidence leads, you would arrive at a conclusion so uncomfortable, so fundamentally disorienting, that most people, when they hear it for the first time, immediately reach for a reason to dismiss it. Your memory does not record the past, it invents it, not in a poetic sense, not as a metaphor for how emotions color our recollections, not as a gentle suggestion that we all have slightly different perspectives on shared events. I mean it in the most literal, mechanical, neurological sense possible. Every time you remember something, every single time, without exception, your brain is not retrieving a stored recording of what happened. It is reconstructing an event from fragments, filling in the gaps with plausible details, and then handing you the result with complete confidence that what you are experiencing is an accurate replay of reality. The memory feels like a recording. It is actually a story. And the most unsettling part is not the fact itself. The most unsettling part is what happens when you truly absorb it, when you let it move from intellectual curiosity into something you actually feel in your bones. Because at that point, the ground shifts, not just under your past, but under your identity, under your certainty about other people, under the courtroom testimonies that send people to prison, the childhood wounds that define adult lives, the arguments with loved ones, where both sides are absolutely sure they remember exactly what was said. All of that is built on something that does not work the way any of us assumed. That is what we are going to explore. Most people think of memory as a kind of biological camera. Events happen, the brain captures them. The recordings are stored somewhere inside the neural architecture, organized and filed, some more vividly than others depending on how emotional or significant the moment was. And when you want to remember something, you press play. The brain retrieves the file, and you experience the event again, perhaps a little faded with time, perhaps a little blurry at the edges, but fundamentally the same event, the same scene, playing back from the original capture. That model is so intuitive that it feels almost self-evident. Of course, that is how it works. How else could it work? And it is the model that quietly underlies how we treat memory in almost every important context in human life. Courts ask eyewitnesses what they saw, and treat the answer as testimony about reality. Therapists explore childhood memories as factual records of what actually happened to a person. Couples argue about who said what during a fight, each certain their version is the true one. We confess to friends that we cannot stop thinking about something painful in our past, as if the past is a fixed place we keep returning to. The whole architecture of how we relate to our own history and to each other's history assumes the camera model. It assumes that when someone remembers something, they are reporting on an actual event, and that errors in memory are failures of retrieval, things fading, details becoming unclear, the picture going soft with time. What the science reveals is something categorically different, not a refinement of the camera model, a demolition of it. The story begins in a laboratory in the 1970s, with a psychologist named Elizabeth Loftus, and a question that seemed almost too simple to be interesting. Can information given to someone after an event change what they remember about that event? She showed participants footage of a car accident, a straightforward scene, vehicles, impact, aftermath. Then she asked different groups different questions. Some were asked how fast the cars were going when they hit each other. Others were asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed into each other. Same footage, same accident. One word different. The people who heard smashed remembered the cars going significantly faster. They were also far more likely to report seeing broken glass in the footage, broken glass that had never been there at all. One word, inserted after the event. And the memory of the event itself changed. Loftus spent the following decades extending this finding in directions that most people find deeply uncomfortable to accept. She implanted entirely false memories in research participants. Memories of being lost in a shopping mall as a child. Memories of a specific accident that never occurred. Memories of meeting a fictional person who existed nowhere except in the study's design. Not in confused or vulnerable subjects. In ordinary people. mentally healthy, tested carefully, who had simply been given certain information in certain ways after a certain point. A significant portion of them not only incorporated the false information, they elaborated on it, added sensory details, described emotions they had felt during the event, defended the memory when questioned. They remembered something that had never happened with the same subjective confidence as memories of things that genuinely had. That result cracked something open in the scientific understanding of memory that has never fully closed again. To understand why this happens, not just that it happens, but why, mechanically, at the level of neurons and biology, you need to let go of the camera entirely and replace it with a different image. Imagine that your memory is not a hard drive storing files. It is a committee of writers who have read the same set of fragmentary notes and are constantly, every time you remember, collaborating to produce what feels like the most coherent and plausible version of events. They use real fragments, sensory traces, emotional residue, spatial impressions, snippets of conversation, but the fragments are never complete. They are never the whole scene, and so the writers fill in. They borrow details from similar events. They apply general knowledge about how things typically go. They consult your existing beliefs about the people involved, the places, the context, and then they hand you the finished story with a felt sense of reality attached to it that is, for all practical subjective purposes, indistinguishable from genuine perception. This is what neuroscientists mean when they say memory is reconstructive. It is not retrieved. It is rebuilt, every single time, from components that include both genuine traces and inferred material that the brain has added to make the whole thing cohere. And here is what makes this more than a laboratory curiosity. Every time you rebuild a memory, you subtly change it. Every time you tell the story of something that happened, you are not just reporting a memory, you are participating in its reconstruction. The telling adds things. The listening of your audience subtly shapes what comes out next time. The emotional state you are in when you remember tints the fragments you are working with. The memory of the memory becomes the memory. Think of it like this. Imagine you have a 1,000-piece puzzle. The original picture was a landscape, a field, a hillside, some trees. But when it was packed up years ago, a handful of pieces were lost, and some pieces from a different puzzle, a similar landscape, got mixed in. Every time you want to look at the picture, you have to assemble it fresh, and every time you use the pieces you have, fill the gaps with what seems most plausible. Include a few pieces that feel right, but belong to a different picture entirely, and convince yourself you are looking at the original. That is not a bug in the system, that is the system. And once you sit with that long enough, the questions it raises start to multiply in ways that are difficult to stop. If memory is reconstructive, if it is assembled rather than retrieved, then what exactly is the self? Because our sense of who we are, not our personality in the abstract, but our lived experience of being a continuous person with a particular history, is constructed almost entirely from memory. I am the person to whom these things happened. I am the child who grew up in that place, who had those experiences, who was shaped by those relationships. I am the accumulation of everything I remember. But if the everything I remember is a series of reconstructions, assembled and reassembled over decades, subtly altered each time, contaminated by later knowledge and current emotional states and the stories I have told about myself to other people, then the self built on top of that is not resting on bedrock. It is resting on a river, something that flows and changes continuously while appearing in any given moment to be solid and fixed. This is where the neuroscience and philosophy begin to converge in ways that feel, if you let them, genuinely vertiginous. The philosopher Derek Parfit spent much of his career arguing that personal identity, the thing we mean when we say I am the same person I was 10 years ago, is far less robust than we assume. Not that it does not exist, but that it is a matter of degree, of overlapping connections, rather than some irreducible essence that persists unchanged. His arguments were largely philosophical. The neuroscience of reconstructive memory makes them feel almost empirically obvious, because if the version of you that exists today has only indirect, fragmentary, repeatedly reconstructed access to the experiences of the version of you that existed 20 years ago, and if that reconstruction has been influenced and altered by everything that happened in between, in what meaningful sense is that the same memory? In what sense is it a direct line to the past at all, rather than a current interpretation of accumulated traces? You have not been carrying your childhood with you. You have been carrying a story about your childhood that has evolved continuously since the original events occurred. Now consider what that means in practice. Consider the arguments that end relationships, the grievances that harden into permanent estrangement, the certainties people carry about who wronged them and how. I know what you said, I remember exactly how it happened, I was there, and they are not lying, they are reporting with complete sincerity what their reconstructive memory is currently producing. But the other person, also not lying, also reporting with complete sincerity, produces a different reconstruction. Two people who were both present at the same event, reconstructing from their own fragments filtered through their own emotional states, shaped by everything that happened afterward, and both of them certain. The legal system has been confronting this with particular urgency. DNA exonerations over the last 3 decades have revealed that the single most common factor in wrongful convictions is eyewitness misidentification. Not corruption, not malice, not even conscious error. People who genuinely believed they saw what they said they saw, who reported their memory honestly, completely with subjective certainty, and who were wrong in ways that sent innocent people to prison for years, sometimes decades. Elizabeth Loftus testified in hundreds of trials throughout her career, explaining this science to courts that were often reluctant to accept it because it struck directly at the foundation of how testimony is valued. The witness was there. They remember. What else is there? What there is, it turns out, is a mind that does not record, that reconstructs, that is influenced by every question asked after the fact, every conversation, every image seen on the news, every detail added by a well-meaning person in the hours and days following an event, and that presents the result of all that influence as unmediated direct access to reality. But here is where I want to complicate the picture in the way that I find most intellectually interesting, the way that turns this from a straightforwardly distressing finding into something genuinely philosophically rich. The reconstructive nature of memory is not a failure. It is not a design flaw in need of correction. It is, as best we can tell, deeply adaptive. A truly literal recording system would be a burden of almost unimaginable proportions. Jorge Luis Borges imagined exactly this in his story of Funes the Memorious, a man who after an accident could forget nothing, who remembered every moment with perfect fidelity, and for whom the experience of living became unbearable, because he could not generalize, could not abstract, could not see the category through the instances. Every dog was not a dog but an irreducible particular that shared nothing, in his mind, with any other particular that had also been called a dog. Memory that reconstructs and generalizes and fills in plausibly is memory that actually functions in a world that is far too complex, far too fast-moving, far too dense with information to be stored whole. The brain is not trying to be a camera. It never was. It is trying to be useful, and useful means flexible. Useful means extracting patterns. Useful means being able to operate tomorrow, in situations that differ from anything encountered yesterday. The cost of that flexibility is accuracy. The cost is that the past is never quite fixed, never quite finished, always susceptible to revision. And this is where something shifts for me, something that took years to settle into properly, rather than just understanding intellectually. If memory is reconstruction, then the past is not the closed and completed thing we assume it to be. It is in a meaningful sense still happening, still being made. Every time we remember, we are not just accessing something that already exists in finished form. We are participating in its ongoing creation. The past is not a place you cannot change. The past as it exists in the only form you can ever actually encounter it, as a neural reconstruction assembled in the present moment, is something that changes constantly, is shaped by every subsequent experience, is sensitive to how it is approached, how it is narrated, what emotional state it is remembered within. That is not a license for denial or dishonest revision. It is something more interesting than that. It means that working with memory, in therapy, in reflection, in conversation with people we have wronged or been wronged by, is not an archaeological project of digging up fixed artifacts from the past. It is a creative project of reconstruction. And like any creative project, it can be done more or less carefully, more or less honestly, with more or less willingness to hold competing fragments, and resist the urge to impose a false coherence on something that was genuinely ambiguous. The most honest thing you can say about your most vivid memory is not "I remember it perfectly." It is "I have a strong reconstruction of it that has been shaped by 20 years of subsequent experience, and every time I have told the story to someone else and every emotion I was carrying the last time I remembered it, that reconstruction feels completely real It may contain genuine traces of what actually happened, and I cannot tell you with certainty which parts are which. That is the honest epistemological position, and almost nobody holds it because almost nobody knows they need to. But perhaps knowing changes something. Perhaps knowing that every person in every argument is working from a reconstruction rather than a recording changes the quality of the certainty each side brings. Perhaps knowing that your most painful memory of what someone did to you is a reconstruction assembled from fragments filtered through decades of your own emotional history makes it possible not to dismiss the pain. The pain is real, but to hold the story about the pain a little more loosely, to be a little more curious about what the other fragments might look like, to be a little less certain that the version your committee of writers has assembled is the only legitimate account of what happened. None of this means the past did not happen. None of this means harm is not real or accountability is not meaningful. It means the mechanism we use to access the past is far more complex, far more creative, far more social and contextual than the camera model allows. And understanding that mechanism accurately is not a step toward nihilism. It is a step toward something more careful, more honest, and ultimately more compassionate, because if no one's memory is a direct recording, if everyone is working from reconstructions shaped by their own particular neural history, then certainty itself becomes something to approach with humility, not abandon, approach with humility, the way a good scientist approaches a result that seems clear, with full recognition that the instrument doing the measuring has known limitations. The instrument is you, the thing being measured is the past, and the measurement changes, at least a little, every time you take it. There are nights when I think about a memory from 20 years ago, something I was certain about for a long time, something I had told the story of dozens of times, and I no longer know how much of it is real, trace, and how much is construction. I cannot separate them, neither can you. Neither can anyone. The camera does not exist. It never did. What exists is something stranger and more alive, a mind that is perpetually making the past in the act of remembering it, constructing a self out of the stories it keeps telling about where it came from, and doing all of this in the sincere belief that it is simply looking at what is there. We are not remembering our lives. We are writing them, continuously, from the inside, in a hand that feels like it belongs to someone else. And now that you know that, I suspect you will never quite remember the same way again,